The world is weird and makes me mad, but at least I get to talk about it with Jose.
Every year, we have a deluge of conservative nonfiction containing the wisdom of pundits and politicians alike. Many of these books pop up on bestseller lists, often under suspicious circumstances, only to vanish a few weeks later. They're marketed as fan merchandise to be consumed, though not deeply understood, and they fit neatly into a publishing niche where some conservative authors put away their long-standing grudges for a chance to make some money. Here's one example. Candace Owens recently had her book reach the New York Times bestseller list. Here was her response on Twitter. "So excited about this. I'm officially a New York Times bestselling author. High five emojis." And 5 days later, she had this to say about the New York Times. "It's time for our Department of Justice to begin looking into the New York Times." Here's a fun fact. This is the tweet that Dave Rubin blocked me for. I was really just posting 2 screen caps of tweets he had made, and they read, "The woke trolls tried to burn it but failed miserably. Now a New York Times bestseller and #1 in the political freedom category." And then a bunch of fire emojis. The second tweet read, "Also, the dirty secret of the publishing world is that the New York Times bestseller list is almost a total fabrication. It's not based on sales. They have a secret formula." Yes, really. It's nice to see these conservatives pretend, at least for a brief moment, that the New York Times is reputable, so long as they can advertise the sales of their own book, of course. These books have such catchy titles. What's so great about America? The 3 C's that make America great. How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps. Death of a Nation. Adios, America. Of Thee I Zing. Stupid Black Man. In Defense of Internment. That's real. Killing the Mob. Killing Crazy Horse. Killing the SS. Killing England. Killing Patton. Killing Kennedy. Killing Lincoln. Killing the Rising Sun. Killing Reagan. Killing Jesus. That doesn't work. Killing the Killers. Finally, someone stopped them. These are a tiny fraction of the many books published in the last 2 decades by conservative pundits and politicians. Comparatively, you don't see as many by left-wing pundits. For example, Bill O'Reilly alone has written more books than the entire MSNBC primetime lineup. Many of these books have a recurring theme, that America is an exceptional nation filled with greatness, and there are forces, typically on the left, that want to destroy it. I wanted to dig into some of these books, so I headed over to my local library and picked out the first 3 books in the political science section by conservative authors. The first was How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps by Ben Shapiro. Second was Addicted to Outrage, How Thinking Like a Recovering Addict Can Heal the Country by Glenn Beck. And the last was Don't Burn This Book, Thinking for Yourself in the Age of Unreason by Dave Rubin. Let's dive into the knowledge, polemics, and philosophy hidden within the pages of these books. How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps is not a great title. The 3 things discussed aren't really steps, and they are definitely not easy, but before we get to them, we have to go through some political theory invented by Ben Shapiro himself. Shapiro splits Americans into 2 camps, those who want to hold America together, or as he dubs them, unionists, and those who want to destroy America, who he calls disintegrationists. Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? According to Shapiro, this isn't a simple left-right divide, as he mentions there are forces on the left and right who can be disintegrationists, though he spends roughly 95% of the book criticizing the left, with a few pages thrown in where he complains about Marco Rubio, and the alt-right even get a few paragraphs. When it comes to left-wing forces trying to destroy America, here's one example he offers. Mario Lopez committed the grave sin of suggesting that it would be dangerous as a parent to determine based on a 3-year-old's gender confusion that the child is indeed suffering from gender dysphoria, adding, "You're just a kid." This was enough to spur E to pressure Lopez for a public apology, which he duly gave. The man has a family to support. So do we all. This breathless description of Mario Lopez nearly having his life ruined had me laughing for a solid 15 seconds when I read it. As if Mario Lopez is one bad take from his family being destitute, living on the streets. And this is representative of a lot of these supposed threats that this book details. Tiny examples, cherry-picked, and then exaggerated to an absurd extreme. And some examples are just flat-out distortions. Here's what one of those looks like. Disintegrationists have categorized culturally unifying symbols like the American flag as inherently divisive. If America, as a concept, is polarizing, so too is the flag. These sentences have a citation that will let us know why Ben is making this very extreme claim. According to the article cited in the book, this is taken from a news story about Travelers Rest High School, where the principal banned bringing the American flag to football games. This was because students were taunting a visiting team from Berea High School, who were mostly Hispanic, by waving the flags in their face and shouting things like, "Go home," leading to confrontations in the stands. Reading the principal's reasoning hardly sounds like Shapiro's characterization. The principal wrote, "Using the American flag to display disrespect or unsportsmanlike behavior is, in itself, improper and disrespectful to our flag." He's clearly saying that it wasn't the American flag that was divisive. He was upset that the flag was being used as camouflage for an attack on Hispanic teenagers. A few days later, after a social media storm, the decision was reversed, although there was no criticism from Shapiro on the mob justice in action here. Also, if you're curious, all of this took place in the conservative Greenville County in the very conservative state of South Carolina, which hardly sounds like a stronghold for the left. In just this little excerpt, we can see that Shapiro has taken a single incident, lied about the intentions behind it, completely ignored the social media mob when it worked in his favor, and then extrapolated his straw man to an entire group he's made up. In other words, it's all a bunch of hot smoke. Now let's get to those 3 steps to destroy America. Step 1 in destroying America is convincing citizens that some people will have to sacrifice their existing rights in order for others to have new ones. What a wonderfully vague statement. Luckily, he expands on what he means by new rights. Saying that society can be improved because children can be molded into literally anything opens the door to life or death fights about what they will be molded into. It's hard to take Ben seriously when he uses terms such as literally anything, as if children are being molded into boulders or rainbows. Throughout this book, and in much of his rhetoric, Ben often characterizes the left in extreme terms to make them sound completely unreasonable. So if someone is saying, perhaps we should, for example, allow children to have a broader understanding of what gender means, it's turned into literally anything. And when he writes vaguely like this, he can make his bigotry against, for example, trans people, sound like some kind of high-minded principle. It's the intellectual camouflage for an ignorant and bigoted opinion. Ben argues quite forcefully that the world is the way it is because of some kind of natural order. He argues that the philosophy behind the founding of the United States of America, as espoused in its founding documents, represent an understanding of fundamental human nature, something Ben never quite defines, that by founding a nation based on this understanding of human nature, the United States has uniquely organized itself to best allow human life to flourish by respecting the natural rights of people. And hopefully alarm bells are going off because even a basic knowledge of American history should reveal how poorly America has respected the rights of people. But that will be addressed in the 3rd step. Instead, the first is about asserting the importance of protecting American values. Shapiro goes on. "We are not gods and simply do not have the capacity to rectify imbalances of innate individual qualities. We don't have the ability to guarantee that even 2 kids the same age living on the same street will start from the same point. 2 children growing up in the same family don't even start from the same point." Shapiro is fixated on this idea of inherent differences, that outcomes can be explained on that basis. You could maybe argue that for individuals, in that when you see a person who has succeeded greatly in the world, it may be down to some kind of innate quality that has made success something easier for them. Though of course that discounts how luck can play a role in an individual's life. For example, the luck of being a failed screenwriter who was fashioned into a conservative media figure by a billionaire trying to influence popular discourse on politics, using millions of dollars to create the illusion of talent. Of course, none of this really matters when we're talking about groups of people. Reducing disparities to individual choices is a convenient way of ignoring structural and historic forces that shape our lives and reduce the chances of groups of people to succeed in the world. Unless the claim is the reason these groups aren't succeeding is because they have all independently made the same or similar individual choices, as if these disparities between 2 groups are the reflection of some kind of natural defect. For example, if poor people are naturally destined to be poor because they are innately incapable of being anything else. Perhaps their innate intelligence, for instance, isn't high enough to succeed in the world. This, of course, is the justification of philosophies such as social Darwinism, which say that people's success in the world is a product of their inherent or natural abilities, as opposed to historical or social forces that shape our lives. Of course, what this argument really does is undermine any attempt to change society for the better. Most of this book is an argument to keep society the way it is and avoid any attempt at improving the structures that shape our lives. There are a few cute moments of hypocrisy in this book, such as one part where Ben Shapiro complains that Elizabeth Warren was selling billionaire tears mugs. Ben Shapiro, the man who has, for years, been selling a tumbler that reads, "Leftist Tears." Though if you really want to shame Elizabeth Warren, accusing her of stealing jokes from Ben Shapiro would be devastating. As always, whenever we hear Ben Shapiro talking about being personally responsible and succeeding on your own merits, I very much recommend the Vanity Fair article that details how Ben Shapiro was able to succeed and become a conservative pundit, not through the strength of his own abilities, but through the careful craftsmanship of a public media persona, through the help of his business partner, Jeremy Boring, and through the investment of millions of dollars to get his Daily Wire operation off the ground. Let's move on to the next step, though. Step 2 in destroying America is undermining our culture of rights in favor of a culture of protection by government. You may have noticed Step 2 doesn't follow Step 1. Why would you need to create new rights in Step 1 if you were creating a culture that undermines them? What Shapiro seems to be really upset by is this expansion of what rights mean, to be anything that he can't effectively tie to the founding documents of America. And of course, he is exclusively privileging his own interpretation of those founding documents. In this discussion of rights, I had expected some mention of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, published in 1948 and adopted by the United Nations, especially considering the American connection of Eleanor Roosevelt. But Ben doesn't really compare or contrast the American founding documents with anything. He describes the evolution of rights throughout much of the Enlightenment as leading up to America, and that discussion ending with its founding, as if the American founding documents were so good and everything that's come afterwards simply isn't worth acknowledging. He simply takes what he knows and seems to assume that it is the best and only version that should be considered. And his evidence for this is the greater material success of the United States on the world stage. History is simply following a script that was destined to happen. Which leads us to this. The third and final step in destroying America is convincing citizens that America represents fruit of the poisonous tree, that America was founded in evil, and that there is no arc to history. To support this very heavy claim, we get a brief rundown of American history, and this gives us a really good understanding of how Ben Shapiro's worldview is shaped. An honest recount of American history is a very mixed record. The country that helped fight fascism in World War II is the same one that enslaved millions for nearly a century. Shapiro acknowledges both sides of the record, but his framing is deeply suspect. Any and all crimes perpetrated by the American state are waved away as simply being products of their time, from the genocide of indigenous peoples being reduced to the norm of nation-states of the day, to slavery being an institution being practiced around the globe. I'm not sure how this is a defense. If he's trying to imply that we should criticize other countries for doing similar things, I fully agree. But instead he's using this to shield any direct criticism of America. This is probably best represented by a quote he uses that comes from Paul Johnson. Europeans were moving into the former hunting grounds of the world's primitive peoples in 5 continents. So when America is engaging in imperialism and seizing lands from indigenous peoples and waging war on its neighbors, it's acting as Europeans do. But whenever the United States writes something lovely in its founding documents, that is uniquely American. It's a highly selective reading of America, designed to emphasize the good as American and the bad as something foreign or belonging to the wider world. When discussing positive things the United States has done, such as the aforementioned fighting of fascism, he titles sections as those as Savior of the West, something uniquely American that only this proud, noble nation could accomplish, as if World War II was fought and won solely by the United States. It seems insulting to all the other nations that participated, but unsurprising as Ben doesn't seem concerned with the histories of other nations or the broader interactions between them, unless it can be used to further glorify the United States. When discussing more negative aspects of American history, Shapiro tends to frame them as favorably as possible. Here's one example describing American westward expansion. Native American population density was, at the time, 0.17 persons per square mile. The Census Bureau historically considered any area unsettled with a population density of fewer than 2 people per square mile. In general, the pioneers were not wrong to cast their eyes westward, although as we will see, this population movement had dire consequences for Native Americans. Ben doesn't even acknowledge the fact that the Census Bureau justifying westward expansion of the American state is ridiculously self-serving. He also makes no mention of the gold rush that sent scores of Americans west, or the concept of manifest destiny which created a religious justification for the American expansion. Instead, the only other factors he really mentions are the looming threat of European powers on the continent, which in many ways reads like the justifications of the day for moving westward, which led to many wars and the displacement and murder of countless indigenous people. Shapiro also feels the need to add that intertribal warfare was common between Native American tribes, and he spends time resisting the noble savage trope. And while I can understand wanting to push back against a stereotype like the noble savage, a better reading of history would be if he instead cast these indigenous peoples as human beings. In many ways, he seems to want the reader to not feel too sorry for these indigenous peoples who were slaughtered and had their ways of life destroyed. His overall view of history is that the bad is commonplace in the world, and even the victims aren't saints. But when there is good, it becomes uniquely American. Or as Ben puts it, when we can find injustice within American history, that is our fault. But that is not America's fault. America was always great, even if she was never perfect. He constantly refers to the eternal and good values represented by America, something sacrosanct and unquestionable, and those who do question anything are to be regarded as disintegrationists trying to destroy the country. It's amazing how little thought went into this book. It's a collection of facts, often misinterpreted or misleading, and a series of premises that aren't even a quarter baked. This was obviously produced as a product to be consumed quickly and without much thought, the sort of thing for fans to buy, not to spark genuine political discussion. Ironically though, I think it's sincere. This probably is Ben Shapiro trying his best to write a thoughtful book about history and philosophy. He's just a bad writer and a shallow thinker. It's perhaps best embodied by this quote here. To most Americans, America is about, and was always about, the gradual realization of those beautiful promises, rights, and institutions for all Americans. Perhaps most of us never thought about all that. Perhaps we just saw the flag flying and felt it, or watched a 4th of July parade and knew it. The book isn't a serious appeal to any well-thought-out concept of America, but rather a vindication of feelings of pride one has when looking at the various symbols of America, a vindication of unthinking patriotism. Ben Shapiro has done the work of figuring out that America is great and blameless, so those reading this book don't have to think about it for themselves and continue their lives at Lormel, remembering to salute the flag. Those who would say otherwise threaten that complacency, possibly upsetting the natural order of things and ruining Ben's cushy life. So what Ben offers in a book like this is a security blanket, an unironic version of that Stephen Colbert book, America, Rebecoming the Greatness We Never Weren't. Let's move on to Glenn Beck's Addicted to Outrage, How Thinking Like a Recovering Addict Can Heal the Country. We need a bit of context on Beck before we move forward, though. This book was published in 2018, and in the years leading up to it, Beck had a bit of an identity crisis. He was a never-Trump Republican, and during the 2016 election, he tried to rebrand himself as a more moderate voice. By 2018, he was pivoting again, claiming that he had gotten Trump completely wrong, and while he didn't like him stylistically, he thought he was doing a good job as president. This book is part of that pivot, where he frames outrage in political discourse as a creation of the media, including himself in his earlier days. But he criticizes himself the same way he criticizes Trump. His tone isn't great, but he still thinks he was right on the facts. For those who don't remember some of those facts, here's a quick example.
We were going to talk about these things. We were going to talk about Obama, the left, internationalists, graft, acorn-style organizations, revolution, and hidden agenda. O-L-I-G-A-R-H. One letter is missing. Why did I select these words? Because acorn selects tides. They all select their words first and then tie them all together into one word. Oligarch. The one that's missing is why.
I'm pretty sure oligarchy has a C in there too. But on the substance of this argument, you may have noticed that the Barack Obama presidency did not plunge America into some kind of socialist oligarchy. But this exemplifies a lot of what Glenn Beck's Fox News show was all about, telling us that Democrats are poised to create some kind of socialist hellscape. These are the supposed facts he stands by. Glenn Beck in this book is trying to present himself as a voice of reason, but he was never a reasonable guy, and he still isn't, and it has nothing to do with his theatrics.
Have I stepped through a wormhole and come out in France? I mean, I'm not really sure. Look, there I am.
Okay, maybe not nothing, but the problem runs a lot deeper than the silly stuff. Glenn Beck's book is a lot like Ben Shapiro's in that it hits similar notes, although to Beck's credit, he presents a more fact-based reading of history. He goes into far greater detail, bringing up specific crimes such as the Trail of Tears, where tens of thousands of indigenous people were displaced and forced to march west, or the destruction of Tulsa's Black Wall Street, where a racist mob ransacked an affluent black community, killing many people and destroying that community's economy. When Glenn Beck gets to the good side of America, it seems thin in comparison to his chapter covering the bad, though he weighs it all away with his discussion about the moral character of America. It's a weird reading of history where, instead of using it to understand the present, he instead would rather us look at history as a means for us to sit back and judge the past, to decipher whether America good or America bad. Beck seems to want us to ignore the past entirely when he writes, "It's not what happens to you historically, what matters is what you do with it now." unless he's talking about learning lessons from history about the left ascending and bringing with it fascism. One example both Beck and Shapiro use to downplay the impact of historical discrimination is when they compare Asian communities to black ones, a comparison that is overly reductive as there are many different Asian and black communities within the United States representing different waves of immigration and different historical experiences. For example, using the case of Japanese Americans, which Ben Shapiro highlights specifically, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II led to the United States government providing reparations, something that has never been done for Black Americans who can trace their ancestry back to slavery, regardless of what anyone even thinks of reparations. The point I'm making here is that these two experiences are not the same, and to compare experiences like these two, as both Glenn Beck and Ben Shapiro do in their books, is misleading. Glenn Beck's books was also annoying to read as he tries to wrap this veil of respectability around himself, still pushing the same ridiculous talking points he always had been. Great example is how he talks about climate change. Beck has a long history fighting against any sort of legislative solution to climate change, and to hear his side of the story, he isn't denying the science, he's simply concerned about the costs. Reading his book, he almost sounds reasonable when he writes, I believe that the globe is warming as much as we can trust and verify the trends. Let me accept the current claim that the world has warmed by 0.7 degrees in the last 100 years. I also accept that man can do significant damage to the planet and has done some damage over the industrial age. It makes sense to me that belching toxins into the air is not good for any of us, including the planet and its other inhabitants over time. Aside from some shaky language, that sounds fine. But less than 2 pages later, he's saying, when you demand absolute acceptance of your theories and back up your science with arguments of moral outrage, you end up having to shove, shout, and, in the end, shoot. And then he goes on to compare climate change to religion and describes one side as the Spanish Inquisition. This, to me, does not sound like the beginning of a reasonable debate. This sounds like Glenn Beck is portraying one side as incapable of it. And more importantly, regardless of what Glenn Beck says about the people who accept broad scientific consensus, what exactly does he suggest we do about the aspects of climate change he's conceded are true? Well, in this book he describes having an energy-efficient foam and some other personal measures, and that's about it. While personal choices and living in a way that's more friendly to the environment can certainly have an impact, a crisis as big as climate change cannot be solved through people choosing to reduce their personal emissions alone. Huge polluters, such as the US military or fossil fuel companies, need to be part of the solution too. When it comes to policy-based initiatives or some kind of collective action to combat something Beck will ostensibly say is true, he's far less willing and instead talks about how vague and untrustworthy science can be. What good does Glenn Beck saying he believes in climate change do if he's not willing to fight for it beyond making a few personal concessions? Beck repeated this pattern in his commentary about the COVID vaccines. Glenn Beck made a tweet about his opinion on the vaccine with this charming photograph replacing a syringe with a middle finger. People assumed he was an anti-vaxxer, so he went on Tucker Carlson's show to explain.
I too am not anti-vaccine. I had COVID, my wife had COVID, everybody in my family had it. I'm not going to get a vaccination because I've already had it.
What he's saying here is wrong. You can get COVID more than once, since the antibodies don't last forever, and a vaccine protects you from more serious symptoms. It also offers a greater degree of protection against new variants. But more broadly, he's using the same tactic he uses when he's talking about climate change. Make as many reasonable admissions as possible, push them aside, and then use a bunch of anti-vax talking points.
And when you make a good case, then we'll follow. Make the case. Exactly. But you can't question.
The problem is, even when he admits to certain parts of the case, his position doesn't change. And if someone's ultimate position stays the same, and the only change to their arguments is that they're predicated by some admissions that ultimately don't change them, they're using those admissions to create the illusion of carefully considering the evidence. An irony here is that in his book, Glenn Beck wrote, "We're spending our time arguing about the efficacy of vaccinations, a question that was pretty much settled 2 centuries ago." So did he believe it was settled then and change his mind in 2021? In 2009, Beck was fear-mongering about vaccines.
If you say, don't take the swine flu vaccination, and then, it turns out that the swine flu, this particular wave, is virulent, and the vaccination would have helped, well then, what role did I play in that? The opposite is true. I say, hey, everybody take the vaccination, and that turns out to be deadly. What role did I play in that?
So he was skeptical of vaccines, then considered them settled a few years later, and now he's once again skeptical. Some additional context might help here. In 2009 and in 2021, These two vaccines were being championed by Barack Obama and Joe Biden. And when we look at that quote from 2018 in Glenn Beck's book, we have to remember that the vaccine discourse at the time was criticizing Trump for repeating lies about vaccine causing autism. In that context, the quote reads less about affirming the effectiveness of vaccines and is instead attempting to get the topic of vaccines out of the public discourse. Beck's support of vaccination changes depending on who he's attacking and who he's trying to defend. He'll accept the science if it's the most effective way to provide cover for someone on the right, and deny it if it's a part of attacking the left. Much like Ben Shapiro, Glenn Beck talks about the Founding Fathers in tones that can only be described as religious. He refers to them revealing an eternal truth. And then there's this line from the book. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights are the most divinely inspired documents, perhaps of all time. I should remind you all that Glenn Beck is a Christian, and it's my understanding that the Bible is pretty important to Christians, but Beck's worldview is probably more accurately depicted in this painting by John McNaughton. One of the funny things about these books is the complete lack of awareness that they are one part in a long line of human history, and that eventually the mightiest empires crumble, and another takes its place. And then they get to pretend that they are the best there ever was, and ever will be. It happened to the Umayyad Caliphate, the Mongol Empire, and the British Empire, and it'll likely happen to the American Empire one day too. Unless we all die before then, of course. The real difficulty with someone who has a religious devotion to their country is that they're not easily challenged, and worse yet, this devotion can be used to justify all sorts of horrible things. Both Glenn Beck and Ben Shapiro aggressively argue for American greatness, its exceptionalism, and would sooner ignore the crimes of history to bask in that glory. The rigidness to their interpretations of what America even means is part of the problem. When the American government was committing genocide, enslaving people, and refusing to acknowledge the rights of women and non-white men, this, politicians of those days would argue, were an accurate interpretation of the founding documents. Of course, many people would disagree with that. The lesson of being open to discussion about interpretation seems obvious to me, but it doesn't seem to have occurred to either Ben Shapiro or Glenn Beck that they might be wrong in their interpretation. To them, these are divinely inspired records of eternal truth. That's not a great way to start the conversation or friendly debate these guys pretend they want to have. And it's telling that their instructions for getting along with them is outlining the certain types of debates they are not willing to have. I was going to spend some time laughing at some of the fails Glenn Beck has throughout his book, but if we're going to laugh at how dumb a book is, there's far more fertile ground in our next volume. Dave Rubin's Don't Burn This Book, Thinking for Yourself in an Age of Unreason is easily the laziest book of the three I read. If Ben Shapiro and Glenn Beck are bringing their own brand of American exceptionalism to the masses, Dave Rubin is the blueprint for how to be fooled by that message. Here's an example of his prose. The left may no longer be liberal, but you're no longer left out. The rest of the book is of similar quality. Of course, Rubin's project isn't to create an intellectual framework for believing something. What he's doing, whether he's aware of this or not, is reinforcing a conservative worldview built on ideas of American exceptionalism. Here's how he opens a chapter. Allow me to open this chapter with a statement that's wildly controversial and gulag-worthy hate speech. America is the greatest country in the history of the world. If you're triggered by this, stop reading. While the second half of that last sentence is solid advice, the rest of it isn't triggering anybody. At best, you might get an eye roll. But what's important is the title of the chapter that this little passage opens. Stop hating straight white men, America, and Western values. Rubin is light on details about what Western values mean, and with regard to hating America, he references some celebrities, but doesn't go into detail about how or why they hate America. As for not hating straight white men, it's an example of how he appeals to identity throughout this book. Although he claims he's doing it ironically, Dave Rubin is constantly talking about people's identities in his book. If someone makes a point he agrees with, he has to let you know that he agrees with them, even though they're a cis white male. And if he disagrees, he has to make a comment about how it's not because they're a woman. Maybe he's just running this particular attempt at a joke into the ground, but even if he's emphasizing everyone's identity for, supposedly, a laugh, how many times does he have to do it until we can safely wonder if he's genuinely obsessed with identity politics? It reminds me of someone who says they ironically enjoy a song and are constantly singing or talking about it. At what point does that irony bleed into real obsession? And sometimes he does the identity shtick in a more nefarious way. One anecdote Rubin brings up is how at one of his live shows he was confronted by an audience member who was a genuine Nazi. Rubin then put this Nazi first in line for the Q&A session so they could have a debate about whether the Holocaust happened. In this discussion, most of the heavy lifting seems to have been done by Rubin's guest, Michael Shermer, though Rubin pats them both on the back for the civilized debate about whether or not this obvious historical fact occurred with a bigoted conspiracy theorist. At no point does Rubin wonder how a Nazi showed up in his audience, and he doesn't explain why he would choose to debate a Nazi instead of, say, someone on the left who might have been there, assuming there was anyone from the left at this particular performance. But the truly sinister part is the paragraph he uses to close the anecdote. One final note on this, it turned out that the Holocaust-denying woman was transgender. Yes, that's right, a trans Holocaust denier. Do with that what you will. What exactly does Rubin expect anyone to do with that? Personally, it means nothing to me. Being trans doesn't disqualify someone from being a hateful conspiracy theorist, but to an anti-trans bigot, it would be a helpful anecdote to push their own agenda of discriminating against trans people, presenting them as mentally unbalanced. Rubin must know who he's serving by bringing up such a meaningless fact. Here's another example of Rubin being completely ridiculous. First of all, no, we're not an imperialist country. The United States was literally founded on a pushback against imperialism. If I may have my own, first of all, I wouldn't reduce the Revolutionary War to a pushback. And second, how can he possibly be this naive? I would think any political commentator would have some awareness of American hegemonic influence around the world. There are American military bases in over 70 countries and territories. The US exerts its influence everywhere. But since it doesn't fit the definition of an imperial power from centuries past, Rubin washes his hands of understanding the tremendous influence the United States has over many parts of the world, and how that might fit the definition of imperial. But it's not surprising he doesn't know or bother to know any of that, because as I mentioned earlier, the one word that captures this book so well is lazy. Rubin brings up a number of different topics, sometimes more than once, and often has little to nothing of value to say about them. At one point in the book, he copies and pastes 3 pages of supposed facts from PragerU. When he tries to do his own version of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, he can't even think of 12 and only writes 6. In the section where he cites his sources, he can barely fill 3 pages. Rubin's final message for the reader, one that encapsulates his political philosophy, is to go out there and live your life and ignore all the nonsense. Yes, his version of activism is to chill out and enjoy life. While I fully support Dave Rubin, or anyone who finds him insightful, to disengage with the political process, he must realize how his final message is the antithesis of a call to action that a political commentator would typically make. Dave Rubin is the Rube Ben Shapiro and Glenn Beck are selling their American exceptionalism narrative to, someone who will unthinkingly accept the mythology of American greatness and then completely disengage from the political process, because there's no reason to improve on something that's already great, unless it's to complain about identity politics, while tacitly endorsing bigotry, of course. The danger of this type of lazy patriotism is that it can be used to maintain a bad status quo, or be used as a cover for the far right to bring in fascism under the cloak of patriotism, reducing a country to facile principles devoid of interpretation or nuance, and then insisting everyone prostrate themselves by proclaiming an overwhelming love of the nation via symbols like the anthem and flag, turns political participation into a sporting event. It's not about making society better, it's about cheering for the home team. And these books aren't weighty discussions of politics, they're merch to buy to show your support for the team you're backing. That is, if anyone is buying these at all. Books by conservative pundits and politicians regularly appear on the New York Times bestseller list, only with a small caveat in the shape of a dagger that appears next to them. Here's the New York Times' explanation. A dagger indicates that some retailers report receiving bulk orders. While not every book by a conservative pundit has one of these symbols next to it, a large number do. In fact, while looking through the hardcover nonfiction list, the dagger symbol almost only comes up for books written by conservative pundits or politicians. In the case of all 3 books I mentioned in this video, they debuted on the list with daggers, indicating bulk purchases, and were on the bestseller list for, at most, 3 weeks. This isn't exactly a new finding, as it was detailed in an op-ed written for The Hill referencing a well-known example of Donald Trump's book Triggered, which reached #1 on the list thanks to a $94,800 purchase from the Republican National Committee. A Vox article describes how appearing on the list can boost sales on average from 13 to 14%, or up to 57% for new authors. It also bestows credibility and potentially a higher advance on future books. An article in Vanity Fair also noted that the former president's son is hardly the only one benefiting from these bulk purchases. The National Republican Congressional Committee spent nearly $400,000 on bulk purchases, notably spending nearly $100,000 buying copies of Dan Crenshaw's Fortitude. In 2015, Ted Cruz used $300,000 in campaign funds to buy copies of one of his books, A Time for Truth. It's easier to track down the bulk sales of politicians because groups like the RNC and NRCC need to publicly report their spending. When it comes to pundits, like the authors highlighted in this video, it gets murkier. Some hypotheses have been floated, such as bulk purchases being demanded ahead of speaking engagements or book signings. It's hard to say exactly, and it's not as though people don't purchase books by conservative pundits. Bill O'Reilly has had plenty of success killing anything with a pulse, but his books tend to stay on the bestseller lists for months at a time, which seems to reflect a genuine interest in his work. These other authors, at least the ones I've covered in this video, don't have nearly the staying power. It reveals a lack of genuine demand for these titles outside of, perhaps, a select devoted few. So devoted that apparently they all engage in bulk purchases. And I don't blame the wider reading public for not caring. These are terrible books. The Dave Rubin one in particular would be more readable after using it as toilet paper, and the other two are little more than poor arguments for American exceptionalism. Assuming someone really is buying these, they would make solid additions to one of the worst libraries of books to ever be created. So what can we possibly take away from this discussion of 3 random conservative nonfiction titles? They seem to be a blueprint on how to disengage with the political process, to accept that America is great and that anyone trying to change it is actually trying to destroy America, that politics are something we don't need to get particularly passionate about. It's best to just disengage and remove yourself from the political process and let the status quo rumble on, completely indifferent to their real-world struggle. Do consider becoming a patron. You can join the lovely names scrolling up the screen right now, and you'll also get early access to videos and links to my theme song. You get all of that at the $5 tier. If you join the $1 tier, you of course get my thanks, but also get access to exclusive updates where I let people know what's going on with the next video. If you'd like to help the channel in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, and if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. Sometimes I do streams, so hitting that bell to see notifications for community posts is a great way to find out when those are happening. Thank you everyone for watching.